what we want to do is talk about fluoroscopy. So we're going to talk about fluoro today and then finish it up another day. Let's see. Let me get this to where I can see everyone as well. Oops. Okay, now I can see everyone. Okay. How many of you all have rotated through fluoro? Okay, so close to half of you. Okay, close to half of you. Let's see, we lost Taylor. Okay. All right, so there she is. So with fluoroscopy, did you all have a chance to look over the PowerPoint or take a look at the chapter, read through the chapter to have a basic understanding of what fluoroscopy is? Before your next test or before your final exam, I'm sure you will peruse through the information, the textbook, as well as the article that I posted for you. Because we'll go into a little more depth with some things and what your textbook does, but your textbook does give you a good overview for this concept. Okay, so for fluoroscopy, there are two different types of fluoroscopy systems, and they're the same, but yet they're different because of the components that make up the fluoroscopy unit. So we are going to be talking about something that is referred to as image intensified systems, and then we'll also talk about flat panel detector systems. So we have two different types of fluoroscopy units. We're also going to be talking about something that's referred to as automatic brightness control. A more common term that's being used now is automatic exposure control rate, or AERC, so you need to be able to recognize those initials as well. We're going to be talking about the modes of operation for fluoro. That is continuous and pulsed. We'll talk a little bit about image display, a little bit about image recording and storage, and then radiation protection. So we'll talk about radiation safety in terms of recommendations and regulations that are in place to protect not only us, but to protect the patient as well. So fluoroscopy. How does fluoroscopy differ from general diagnostic radiography? What's different about fluoro?
Continuous. Dynamic.
It's continuous. So it's another name for that is dynamic. So it's dynamic imaging. It's real-time imaging. So it's like using your smartphone in video mode. Whereas general diagnostic radiography is like using your smartphone in photo mode. You just get a single shot image where there's no motion. So fluoro is it shows us motion. So it's real-time imaging. That's what it is. So in the early days for fluoroscopy, this is what the unit looked like. Okay, this is what the unit looked like. This was a fluoro tube, and it had to be used in conjunction with an X-ray tube. But this is the actual fluoroscopic device, and this particular area here, it was a phosphor screen. There was a lead glass backing that was there as well. But this phosphor screen, what it would do is the X-rays would enter this phosphor screen, and it would cause the phosphors to glow. The X-rays would be converted to light, and that light was the image. And so that image was directly viewed by the radiologist. So, notice that the physician had to have his eyes directly against that device. And it's kind of hard to tell, but this is like material, a fuzzy type of material that was around that particular area of the fluoroscope. And that's because, you had to have that held relatively tight to the face. And so it added some cushioning, and it also helped to prevent outside light from getting in, because then it would be really, really hard to see the image. But this is what the early fluoroscopic device looked like. If you think about our lab in the x-ray room 2, that big bulky device that's by the table. That is our image intensifier. That's our fluoro unit. So now, that device is big and bulky, whereas here in the early days, it was a very lightweight type of device. But the problem with this particular type of device is that the amount of light that was emitted when the x-rays were converted to light, it wasn't a very high amount of light. It was very low light levels. So it made the images hard to see. You had to kind of be in total darkness here, so you had to have a nice secure fit so that you could really appreciate the brightness of the image, so that you could see the image. There was also very high patient exposure in order to get enough light to even be able to make out what that image was. And the spatial resolution was terrible. But this was the early type of device. And so here you see another rendition of it here. And they've got a patient on the table, and underneath the table is the x-ray tube. So the x-rays come up, interact with the patient, and that remnant beam will interact with this phosphor screen and cause it to glow, and you would see the image. But it was kind of a rudimentary image. It wasn't the best image, but nonetheless, this was a start. So let me see if this will end up working here. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. You able to see this? You're not able to. Okay, so that's not going to share. Okay. Okay. You able to see my screen now? You able to see the back to the PowerPoint? Okay, but you can't see the other. Okay. When you have a moment, look up this link here, and it shows you how, look up these 2 links, and it shows you how fluoroscopy was used even in stores. So it was used for shoe fitting. So you would go to the shoe store, and you would stick your foot into a fluoroscope device, and you could see how close your toes were to the end of the shoes. So it was actually used in shoe stores. And some places still use these fluoroscopes for shoes into the 1940s and even the early 1950s. One of my grandparents remembers going to the shoe store and using this device when she would buy shoes. So when you have a moment, just look at it, because it's kind of neat, to see. Obviously, at that point, really didn't appreciate the potential damage that radiation exposure could do. So if you go to a store now, you're not going to find these types of devices for shoe fitting. But, back in the 1940s, like I said, even some places in the early 1950s still had these devices in place. So it's kind of neat, in a way that they use these things. Does anyone by chance know who invented the fluoroscope? Anybody know? I'll give you a hint. It's the same person who invented the light bulb.
Florence Nightingale.
I like it, Florence Nightingale. The name's perfect, you're right. How long did it take you to think of that one, Brett? I like that one. I'm going to have to use that one, Florence Nightingale. That's a good try. So who invented the light bulb?
Newton.
Pardon?
Newton?
Not Newton.
Edison.
Who said it? Somebody said.
Edison.
Edison. Yeah, Edison. Also like the founding father of General Electric. Okay. Yeah, so Thomas Edison, he invented the fluoroscope. He invented the fluoroscope. You can actually go and visit his workshop. It's down in Fort Myers, Florida. Has anybody by chance been down there and seen his workshop? He actually he had a summer home there in Fort Myers, Florida, and so you can go and visit his workshop and see some of the original fluoroscopes and other types of devices that he worked on. An interesting fact about Thomas Edison, like I said, it was his summer home in Fort Myers, Florida. His next door neighbor, who also had a summer home, was Henry Ford. So they both had summer homes in Fort Myers, Florida, right next to each other. So you can also go and visit Henry Ford's summer home, and you can look at some of his original automobiles, like the Model T, the Model A. So that's pretty cool. In fact, it was Thomas Edison who talked Henry Ford into doing mass production. So that's how he ended up with the Ford plants, is because Thomas Edison encouraged Henry Ford to do that. So anyway, if you're ever down in Fort Myers, Florida, it's kind of neat to see that. Okay, so this was the early fluoroscope, and then improvements were made, like you see here. So this is more of a modern day fluoroscope, but we're making improvements to these too. And at some point, these will probably go by the wayside. But this is what we call image intensified fluoroscopy. So this is an image intensified unit. And what this unit will do is it will also convert X-rays to light, just like the early systems did. But compared to the original fluoroscope, this particular unit will increase the brightness of the image. That's why it's called image intensified, because it increases the brightness of the image. The brightness of the image is great enough that we can actually view the images on a monitor. We don't need that funky little device that you put up to your eyes in order to view the image. So the image can be viewed on a monitor. It can be viewed on a monitor. The other thing that we have the ability to do is to record the images. There was no way to record the images with the original fluoroscope, but now image recording is possible so that you can save those images, because that's documentation. It's part of the patient's medical record. Compared to the original system, this unit results in lower patient exposure, and it has increased spatial resolution compared to the early units. So this was a major improvement compared to what Edison had developed. In terms of configurations, you'll see the image intensifier in one of two locations. This type of configuration is referred to as an above table configuration because the image intensified unit is located above the X-ray table. So the image intensifier, this is the actual image intensifier in here, and it's mounted to what we call the fluoro arm. This is the extension piece that will pull over the table. We've got it down in our lab, and we'll take a look at it in that last lab that we have. And then the X-ray tube is underneath the table. So it's mounted under the table. So we'll take a look at that in our last lab. The other type, so this is what it looks like. The image intensifier, here's the patient, and the X-ray tube is down below. The other type of configuration that we can have is referred to as a below table configuration, because the image intensifier unit is situated below the table and the X-ray tube is above the table. Okay. Did anybody those of you that were in fluoro, did you work with a below table configuration? Or was the image intensifier above? What'd you work with? Do you remember? Above.
And I actually spent a little bit of time in fluoro and peds my first week, and I found it interesting that there was, I guess, a radiologist student in the room, and I guess her instructor was in there with her and asked her where the radiation was coming from, and she didn't give the right answer. And I was thinking, man, we know that.
Good. So the person was from another radiography program?
No, she's a radiologist. student, a doctor's student.
An actual, okay. So, okay, okay,
Yeah,
okay,
she was doing the radiologist job.
okay. Gotcha. See? And you know, the thing is, you all do end up knowing a lot more about equipment operation, and believe it or not, you all, to some extent, even end up knowing more about image quality than, you know, what some of the radiologists do. You've got a better understanding of the factors that control image quality, or contrast, spatial resolution, and that type of thing. So good. I'm glad you knew that. That made you feel good then, didn't it? Like you accomplished something. That's right. So this is your below table configuration. This is a C-arm configuration. Has anybody been to surgery and you've had to drag the C-arm along with you? Okay, so you got to do that as well. Okay. So this is a C-arm configuration, and that C-arm, it's called a C-arm because it looks like a C. You can arrange it so that the image intensifier is either below or above, but the best configuration is to have it turned so that the image intensifier is on top. Okay. So C-arms, they can be mobile, they can be taken into the surgical suite. This particular example here is a fixed C-arm. You may see this being used in a vascular procedure suite. So it's a fixed unit. So in interventional radiography, they would have these types of units as well. So that's just a C-arm. All right, so now what we need to do is look at the components of the C-arm. Okay. So we're going to look at the input phosphor, the photocathode, electrostatic lenses, the anode end, and at the anode end, there is something that is referred to as the output phosphor. So these are the components that we're going to look at and talk about. In terms of what these are made of, the one that I really care that you know the composition is the input phosphor. The input phosphor is made of cesium iodide. And that's not a stranger to you. We've talked about cesium iodide. What does cesium iodide do?
That convert X-rays to light.
Converts X-rays to light. Well, guess what the cesium iodide does in the fluoro tube?
Same thing.
Same thing, converts X-rays to light, okay? But I do have the other components listed here, and your book happens to mention them as well. Photocathode is antimony and some alkali metals. The output phosphor has a little bit of aluminum, and then the backing is a zinc cadmium sulfide. I'm not going to ask you about this composition on the test, the zinc cadmium or the antimony, but I do expect you to know the cesium iodide, okay? And so we'll go through and we'll talk about, what these components do. So if we were to be able to see inside of this protective housing, this is what the image intensifier looks like. When we're in lab on that last day, I'll show you an image intensifier. This is one that I have down in the lab. And so I'll take it out of the box so that you can kind of see what it looks like, so you get an idea as to the size of it. So I'll take that out for you to take a peek at. Okay, so here we've got this graphic representation of the image intensifier. Let me point out though, if you look here, you see how there is curvature to the image intensifier. When I did this graph, I wasn't able to get the curvature quite right, and so I actually drew it flat. But you have to keep in mind that there is curvature to this. Okay, there is curvature. One slide in here, I think I might have a curve to it. But anyway, it's not flat like this. There's actually a curve to it. Okay, it curves. All right, so we'll look at the components. First is the input phosphor. This is the input phosphor. So what you see in green is the input phosphor. So the way this is situated is, if you go back to this slide here, the input phosphor would be the first layer that the X-rays interact with. So the X-rays, the remnant beam, it's coming up through this device into the image intensifier. All right, into the image intensifier. So what the input phosphor does is it takes those X-rays and converts it to light. So the yellow represents the X-rays and it converts it into light. If you notice, we have more light photons than we do X-ray photons. This is one reason why this is fire. It is going to intensify the image. It's going to intensify the image. So you have X number of X-rays and it produces more light photons than it does for that given number of X-ray photons. The next layer of material that it interacts with is what we call the photocathode. And the photocathode, here's where your medical terminology can kind of come into play. Photo means light, and when you think of the word cathode, think of electrons. Like when we talk about the X-ray tube, what comes off the cathode end? Electrons. So the photocathode, what it does is it takes the light photons and converts it into electrons. So that's how it gets its name, photocathode, converts light into electrons. Okay? So we've got our electrons here. And then you'll notice in this particular example, I've only drawn in 3 electrostatic lenses, a total of 6, but 3 on each side. So that's what's represented here. These are electrostatic lenses. And the electrostatic lenses have a voltage applied to them. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 to 35,000 volts are flowing through this image intensifier. What that does is that voltage will drive the electrons to the anode end of the tube. This is what's called the anode end of the tube. Okay, this is the anode end of the tube. So the electrons are accelerated towards the anode end of the tube. So we've got that potential difference there. Just like in the X-ray tube, how the electrons have to be driven over to the anode end of the tube by voltage, the same thing happens here. So voltage is applied to these electrostatic lenses to drive them towards the anode end of the tube. But you'll notice that the electrostatic lenses, because of the way they're situated, that they narrow that electron beam. They narrow that beam. So what they're going to do is those lenses are going to focus the beam to an area that's referred to as the focal point. Okay? And you'll see this more shortly. But they narrow that beam down to a focal point. So the electrons are accelerated and they are narrowed down to a focal point. All right. Then what happens is at that focal point, they then spread out and hit what we call the output phosphor. So this is the output phosphor here, the output phosphor. And this is the output phosphor. The output phosphor takes those electrons and converts the electrons to light. Converts it to light. So we start with X-rays. X-rays get converted to light. The light gets converted to electrons. They are rapidly accelerated and focused. And then they're allowed to spread out just a little bit to interact with that output phosphor, because we don't want just a single point source, because then we won't end up with an image. It's kind of like when X-rays come out of the X-ray tube, they don't come down in a single straight line. They diverge out. So they diverge out and they hit this output phosphor, and then they're converted to light. But we end up with many more light photons than the number of X-rays that we started with.
So the output phosphor converts it from electrons back to
light. And we end up with many more light photons than the number of electrons, then the number of light photons that came from the photocathode, then the number of X-rays that we started with. So the image brightness is greatly intensified. So one of the things that helps to intensify the brightness of this image is the fact that voltage is applied, a high level of voltage is applied to these electrons. And so when they slam into this output phosphor, we get a lot of light being produced from that high acceleration. Kind of like when the electrons are accelerated from the cathode to the anode in the X-ray tube, the more energy the electrons have, the more interactions they can undergo to produce X-rays. So the same thing happens here. This high voltage allows these electrons to have a lot of kinetic energy. So they have a lot of energy to impart and interact with the metals in this output phosphor, and that ends up yielding a large number of light photons. And that's our image. That's our image. But it's going to be intensified in terms of brightness. That's what the image intensifier does, is it brightens the image.
Can you explain the point of, or the purpose of the focal point again? So
We'll get to that. Right now, just know that this little area here is called a focal point. It'll make a little more sense when we get to the appropriate slide to talk about it. So just trust me, it'll come up again, and then it'll make a little more sense. Okay. And remember, I told you to remember that this is actually curved, and the reason the input phosphor is curved is we want an equal travel distance for the electrons. We want to maintain the amount of distance that the electrons have to travel. If we had a flat surface like this, the electrons on the periphery would have a longer distance to travel, and that would actually end up decreasing some of the spatial resolution, and we could actually end up losing some of those electrons. So the input phosphor is curved. It is curved, and it helps to give us better spatial resolution, and it also prevents us from losing those electrons around the periphery. And then the fact that we have a small output phosphor that is hit by rapidly accelerated electrons, that's what gives us that intense brightness for our image. It helps to increase that brightness. So those are the components. So on a test, you could be asked, identify the input phosphor. I might give you a picture like this and have an arrow pointing to the input phosphor and have you identify it. I might ask you what the input phosphor is composed of. It's cesium iodide. So be able to label a diagram like this and know what the components do. All right. How about let's take a 10-minute break. To make it easy, why don't you come back at 10:10?